You're listening to the Journey podcast. Can awareness and compassion transform the fight against eating disorders? Join us for today's impactful episode. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Journey Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this powerful episode, we explore the complex and often misunderstood world of eating disorders, guided by a leading advocate known for her profound work in this field. Our guest shares invaluable insights and personal experiences that illuminate the challenges and nuances of living with and recovering from an eating disorder. We delve into the emotional, psychological, and societal factors that contribute to these conditions, offering a compassionate and comprehensive exploration of eating disorders. Hope Virgo is an author and a multi-award-winning international leading advocate for people with eating disorders. Through sharing her harrowing but inspiring story, Hope helps young people and employers, including schools, hospitals, the government, and businesses, to deal with the rising tide of mental health issues, which affects 1 in 4 people and costs employers between 33 and 42 billion pounds annually. She has been described by icon and sports presenter Jeff Stelling as the indefatigable Hope Virgo. Hope is also a recognized media spokesperson, having appeared on various platforms, including BBC Newsnight, The Lorraine Show, Good Morning Britain, Sky News, and BBC News. Hope is the founder of the Dump the Scales campaign, which put eating disorders on the government's agenda. The campaign has gone from strength to strength, making change happen on a national scale. She has been invited to number 10 Downing Street to meet with the Prime Minister's political advisors multiple times and hosted in 2023 the first ever eating disorder march in the UK. Hope continues to campaign for better access to treatment and adequate funding for eating disorders because no one with an eating disorder is untreatable. Here is my interview with Hope Virgo. Hi, Hope. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because eating disorders are such an important and profound topic in today's world. And we've actually never spoken about it on the podcast before. So this will be a wonderful conversation to have and to share with our listeners. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on today, and welcome to the podcast.
No, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's really great to be here. And yeah, I think for me, eating disorders aren't talked about enough. So it's always good to have the chance to kind of talk in much more detail about what they are, kind of the causes, everything around them as well.
Yeah, it's something that gets kind of covered up, I feel, a little bit. And maybe 20, 30 years ago when I was a teenager, we didn't talk about that at all. It was sort of a very dirty thing that you just kept quiet and you didn't talk to anyone about. So I absolutely feel the same. So excited to dive into this conversation and to explore this deeper. Would you like to share a little bit about yourself and your own story, your own journey, and where you have been and what you do today?
Today, I basically campaign on eating disorders. So I spend my life kind of traveling all over the world, working with anyone who's interested in eating disorders. So that kind of includes schools, big corporates. Here in the UK, I do work with the NHS, private eating disorder hospitals as well, and then also do this kind of a whole strand of campaigning. So trying to get people to really understand eating disorders, trying to get people to understand why we need to invest in them better, and also to try and challenge a lot of the stigma around eating disorders. And the reason that I do it is I've had my own lived experience of being in recovery from anorexia. So I was diagnosed when I was 16, 17 years old, but I'd actually kind of started presenting with anorexia when I was about 12, 13 years old. And for me, it's so important to talk about eating disorders because as you touched on, there is still this huge amount of stigma around them. People don't get it. People still think that eating disorders are a choice, that they only affect white teenage underweight girls, that people are just being difficult about food, or they're a vanity exercise. But actually, eating disorders are really serious mental health issues. And I think for me, what's really scary is over the last couple of years, we've seen this huge increase in people struggling with eating disorders. And I still believe that the statistics don't show probably the real issues at play. I think we often hide behind not diagnosing people properly and turning people away from services, which means that not everyone is included in those statistics. But even though we're seeing this huge rise, people still don't get it. People are still being marked as untreatable, told they're too complex, not able to access services. For me now, it's even more important than ever to be pushing these conversations around eating disorders, just to make sure that people can get the right support, but also that people know that actually you can fully recover from an eating disorder.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I am curious, how does this break down in terms of, are there any statistics, eating disorders, male versus female, sort of the age brackets? I kind of get the sense that when you say that started in 12, 13, and then in the teenage years, that's a very common experience from also my lived experience and what I know. But is that what is happening in the world today? Or is there also eating disorders being diagnosed later in life? Is that very common?
Yeah, so there's an amazing project actually called EDGY, which are looking into the genetics behind eating disorders. And one of the things they've recently found out is that actually we're getting a high percentage of people over the age of 18 who are presenting for the first time with an eating disorder. So I think historically, we did think it was just something that affected teenagers, but actually we're seeing the kind of, statistics changing around that and more older people struggling. And I think as well, we are seeing again, another onset of people struggling when you hit your menopause as well. So people who are older too, who are also struggling. And from a male perspective to a female perspective, I think eating disorders do present in people of all different genders. The statistics still show that actually it is more females that do get diagnosed with an eating disorder, but also the presentations might be slightly different in genders as well. But I often wonder, and actually it's interesting, so through the campaigning that I do, I have a lot of males that come forward to me and they'll tell me that they've tried to get support for an eating disorder, but then GPs will tell them, oh, you're not a female, you don't have an eating disorder. So again, I wonder whether some of the statistics are slightly kind of skew with regards to actually whether we're really recording things properly. And I think that, again, is a really hard thing with eating disorders, is because stereotypically everyone has this image of someone with an eating disorder as that white teenage underweight girl. But actually we're seeing more and people in all different body sizes as well presenting with eating disorders. And that then means that those people find it even harder to access treatment. And we know, again, with eating disorders that only 6% of people with an eating disorder will ever fall into that underweight bracket. So you've got this 94% cohort of people who don't look like they stereotypically have an eating disorder. And so for them, there's a whole load of additional shame and guilt and kind of stigma when they reach out for that support, which again is just wrong on so many levels.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a big educational component that's missing at this point on the public level, but also in the healthcare system where maybe the support that they're looking for, those professionals haven't exactly been educated on how this is developing. So they kind of stamp it off as, oh, you're fine. And you're not female, you're not a teenager. So this doesn't really fit what we've learned.
Yeah.
So when we talk about eating disorders, they come in all shapes and sizes and people have various levels of experiences with that. What have you come across when people talk about their eating disorders? What are some of the common experiences that they have? And what are the diagnoses around that? Is it okay to label the eating disorders, or is it preferable to just bring the help and the support? Is it helpful to have a diagnosis or a label? Where do we stand at with that at the moment?
Yeah, really, really good question. And I think, again, it's very unique to individuals. The kind of joining factor within being negative towards diagnosis is particularly around a diagnosis called atypical anorexia, which is when an individual presents with anorexia, but in a higher BMI. And we have been working for the last year or so, 2 years, 3 years, probably quite a long time actually, to try and get rid of that kind of atypical anorexia diagnosis and just to straight call it anorexia. I think with regards to diagnosis, I do believe that a diagnosis can be really helpful for individuals. It can help kind of look at what treatments are available for that person. But one of the issues I do have with it is that we very much then take on a kind of one size fits all approach to treatment. And particularly here in the UK, but also across the world as kind of on a global scale as well, we aren't seeing money going into research to work out what the best treatments are for people with eating disorders, which means, again, there's a lot of people who are struggling. They maybe go and get one sort of treatment, and that treatment doesn't work. And instead of the clinicians or the healthcare providers changing up that treatment, they're just saying, do you know what, that treatment's not working. We're going to mark you as untreatable, or we're going to say you're too complex. And for me, that's when there's an issue with a diagnosis, that we're then looking at a very small bucket of support for them. And I think, again, that's something that we're seeing a lot more of, particularly here in the UK. But again, I have done a fair amount of work in Australia and Singapore. And again, in those parts of the world, there's very little inpatient support. There's very little, few beds available. So for them to get treatment in somewhere like Australia, for example, you have to fit so neatly into a particular BMI bracket. And then the focus on treatment is very much, if they've got anorexia, about weight restoring them. And then you discharge them back out into the community where there is zero support available for them.
Yeah. And we see that, I think, with a lot of physical and mental health challenges, that the support system just isn't available. And many people, even in the family and friends circle, just don't really understand what is happening. And even though they might be very happy to provide support, they might just not know how to do that. So I'm guessing the first port of call in eating disorder challenges is usually a family doctor or a general practitioner or something like that. And where can people go from there? What is available, for example, in the UK, was once they've spoken to their doctor, what comes after that? What's available?
Yeah, so what tends to happen here in the UK is people will go to their doctor, they'll have an assessment done, they'll often get weighed. Then in some situations, that individual will be referred to the eating disorder service within their locality. In some situations, they won't even get to see the eating disorder team, and the doctor will tell them that they're not thin enough, they don't look sick enough, anything like that, which is like a real barrier of mine. And then if they do get through to see the eating disorder service, again, they'll have another assessment there. In the UK, we have very strict waiting times on eating disorder treatment. The eating disorder service tries to see every single person, particularly children, within a 2-week period. But even if that person gets an assessment within that 2 weeks, it doesn't mean they're going to start therapy immediately. They'll either be discharged back out into the community and monitored by their GP, if they can get a GP appointment, or they'll be put on a waiting list for, it could be anything, from 6 months to 4 years. I've got people who've been on waiting lists still trying to get support. And again, that's very individual to different eating disorders. So people with ARFID, which is avoidant food restrictive disorder, they again have an even longer list because there's very few specialists available to treat people who've got ARFID. And I think that's the really scary thing at the moment, is often because there isn't support available, people are going back out into the community, back out into their homes, and are being left to get more and more unwell. And families are often left to pick up the pieces. And although you might have a brilliant family network of support around you, your parents or your loved ones, even your friends or your siblings, they're not supposed to take on that role of making sure that you're eating enough and that you're fueling right and you're not doing as much exercise or anything like that. So I think for families, it puts a huge amount of pressure on them to try and fix everything. There's so many amazing organisations that are trying to empower carers to offer that additional support. But for me, it's often not enough. It's thinking, actually, what can we do from a healthcare perspective to really give people the right support in the right way? And the reason we lack it so much here in the UK is we've had decades of underfunding, we've had decades of stigma, we've got a very kind of hit and miss workforce with regards to eating disorder treatment. It's not seen as a specialty in so many areas, if people don't go and train into it. And because of all of those gaps within the workforce, it just means that the support isn't available for individuals. And I think, again, for me, it then becomes much more complicated because we know with something like anorexia, the less you're fueling yourself, the more you're restricting, the more your brain chemistry is going to change, and the more you're going to get in the grips of the eating disorder. So it's like leaving people to kind of suffer for longer and longer and longer and not getting in there when we know that early intervention can really save people's lives.
Have you, in your experience of working with providers and sort of across the globe, are you finding that anything is changing? Are we taking any steps to plug those gaps with helpful services, with helpful support? Or is this just kind of staying status quo and nothing is really being done?
So it really depends on where you are in the country at the moment. And also very much depends on clinicians and where clinicians are at with things. as an example, so in Oxford, they have a really, really good eating disorder team there. So they did a trial of a model called ICBTE, which they rolled out. It's had a 70% success rate on people making a full recovery from anorexia, which I think is the best we've had in the country. But that service isn't being rolled out anymore. And I think part of that's like a political thing. I think it all becomes way too political when we're looking at services. And honestly, I think in some areas it becomes very career driven. So other clinicians don't want to take on board someone else's model because they want to come up with their own model. And then you kind of look at other areas of the country, places in the east of England, you look at areas like Northamptonshire, where a lot of people with eating disorders are having their care taken away from them. They're being moved onto palliative care pathways. And for me, whether we're officially moving someone onto a palliative care pathway or we're just withdrawing treatment, it's exactly the same thing for that individual. We're leaving them to go home and suffer and potentially die at home because of an eating disorder. So I think what we need here in the UK and probably across the world as well is a real investment into treatment. We need to look at not just spending more money, but look at actually where we want to spend money, how we can improve services, what research can we properly invest in to make sure people get the right treatment, and where is the evidence-based treatment, and why aren't we rolling that out? Why aren't we offering people different things? And I think once we have that in place, it will then kind of help empower people. And it might also help more people want to go into eating disorders and work in that area because they're seeing people make a full recovery and they're able to kind of contribute to that part of society as well. And I was thinking recently, it's really interesting. I'm 33. And obviously I went into treatment when I was kind of 16, 17, and I spent a year living in an inpatient unit. But I didn't get evidence-based treatment at that point in my life. And I've never had evidence-based treatment. I've never had intensive psychological treatment to tackle my eating disorder. And although I'm in a really good space with it, I still struggle with things from time to time. And there was a massive group of people who will be a similar age to me, people who are maybe slightly younger, people who are older, who've never had that evidence-based treatment. But people like me don't qualify for treatment anymore because we're not underweight, because we've been unwell for a long time. And we're seeing, again, more and more clinicians kind of going down this route that if you've been unwell with an eating disorder for 5+ years, they're not going to treat you anymore. And it's all those individuals that just haven't had the kind of right and proper treatment.
That's really interesting that you say that, because that is exactly that ongoing support that I think would be extremely helpful to help keep building a solid foundation that you can move forward from. And you touch on an interesting component of the psychological component of eating disorders, because we often just think it's a physiological thing. It's you just don't eat. But of course, eating disorders encompass many more components on so many complex levels than just not eating physically. So what are some of the things that are involved in eating disorders that we might not be as aware of? So a psychological component, the physical component, what else comes together in eating disorders?
I guess the dietitian support. So making sure we've got that kind of extra support around the food. I know you've touched on the physical element, but also people kind of breaking their food rules, people kind of challenging the fear food rules as well. I do think there's a wider role within society and within treatment as well. I think there's a huge amount of fat phobicness, which we see in eating disorder treatment. I think so much of the time, particularly with something like anorexia or orthorexia, again, we get people to this kind of set BMI bracket and we don't push them to gain any more weight or kind of weight restore to like the weight that their body should be at. And I think that does come back to people being fat phobic within services as well. So I think there's a wider thing within treatment where we need to be educating the workforce on actually what's happening. I think there's also issues from a physical approach. Actually, how are we getting people who are in treatment to weight restore and then get to a space where they're able to function kind of out in the real world, like out of hospital? I work with people nowadays who've been in hospital for, 6-7 years with an eating disorder. And their whole identity is wrapped up in the eating disorder. They've become really institutionalized. In some situations, they don't feel like they're ever going to get better because they've never had the proper treatment to get better. So I think for individuals like that, it's about thinking about, do you know what? We need to hold our hands up and say, do you know what? As a system, we have failed you. We have let you down. What can we do to try and shift this? Who can we bring in to kind of assess you again, get another opinion and see what treatment and support might look like moving forward? And then again, back to that kind of dietitians, or actually, how are we working with dietitians to make sure that we're then educating people with the right information around nutrition, kind of getting rid of all of that wellness stuff that we see on Instagram, for example, but actually giving them the kind of right concrete information too. But I think this starts way before people get admitted to treatment. And I think from a broader area, we need to be looking at that from a preventative perspective. Actually, how are we getting in there and spotting the signs earlier on? How are we getting in there with an early intervention? How are we working with schools, with universities, with hospitals even, where if someone comes in and gets treated for something else, to kind of know what signs we should be looking out for with regards to eating disorders. We do it with other physical illnesses, and actually we should be doing with eating disorders too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in all this work that you have been doing, what are the causes of eating disorders nowadays? Have they changed from 20, 30 years ago? We obviously have a lot more social media nowadays, which may not be very healthy for some people. What are you seeing that is really driving this rise in eating disorders? What are some of the causes?
Yeah, so I think firstly, it's really important to remember, and a lot of the research that's coming out recently has shown that particularly with something like anorexia, there is a predisposition, so a genetics to developing the eating disorder. What then tends to happen is you have all these contributing factors at play, then that individual will be triggered. They'll go into an energy deficit, and that is then what causes the eating disorder and keeps them in the hold of it. But with regards to kind of contributing factors, I think probably to some extent they have changed over the last couple of kind of decades or so. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of people presenting with eating disorders who believe their contributing factors to be things like the pandemic. So obviously that kind of uncertainty we were all in, that kind of fear and isolation, again, real driving factors and kind of this perfect solution for eating disorders to solve. Beyond that, I think social media does have a role to play. And I think particularly with regards to kind of when someone is in the grips of an eating disorder, again, kind of keeping them in the grips of it, that kind of constant comparison, the constant judging, the constant wellness influencers who are sharing really unhelpful information. I think then again, the messaging around exercise. Here in the UK, we currently have calories labeled on all of our menus in restaurants. Again, that's not the right way to go around doing things. And I think sometimes we have to go back to the basics, even with things like that, to think, do you know what? We've normalized eating disorder culture here in the UK. We've normalized eating disorder culture in so many other parts of the world. What are we doing to sort of challenge that and to educate people on the fact that actually we have this normalization around eating disorders, but it doesn't have to be this way? And I think for me, the other thing is, so I developed an eating disorder, like I said, when I was about 12, 13. And although obviously my genetics had a role to play, a big thing for me was kind of numbing my emotion, like numbing those things I didn't want to feel. And it became like this best friend to me. It kind of told me what I should do. It gave me this real sense of purpose, and it took me out of the reality of growing up. And I think for so many people with eating disorders, the eating disorder becomes this kind of comfort, and it becomes this distraction to life when you don't want to be feeling things. And again, that's when you're in that recovery process, it gets really challenging because you start to feel all of these things that you just don't want to feel. And that's why having that psychological input alongside fueling yourself in the right way, they have to come hand in hand together. But at the moment, I don't think treatment is set up to give you both things in a lot of situations.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing, because back when I was diagnosed, I was basically just told to just go exercise so that you're more tired and more hungry, and then everything will resolve itself, which now looking back at that, I can't even hardly believe that that was medical advice that I was given. So there's a lot to be done to kind of steer those things in the right direction and educate people. Now, in your journey, have you found anything that was helpful for yourself on this path of healing? Have you come across anything where you thought, okay, actually, this was quite well done and this helped me? Have you found anything like that?
Yeah, I think for me at the start, it was probably having space to communicate. So kind of unpacking what was going on, a space to communicate around my meal times and my snack times. I think for me, going into having this kind of routine and structure around food was really, really important. And I began to then, I guess, realize that what I was doing was not normal and it wasn't a normal behavior. I've had this fear of recovery. I did have it for a very long time, that this fear of weight change, what if it doesn't stop? And I had to start to make sure that on the other side of that fear, there was this really appealing kind of picture at play that I could then learn to kind of trust the process around it and kind of trust things moving forward. I think a big thing for me now, and this is because I'm much further along in my recovery than I've ever been, is kind of thinking about my reasons for wanting to get well. So I think for so many people, when you have an eating disorder and you feel completely invincible, you think that your life will just carry on and that everything will be okay. But at some point, we have to tackle all of these things that are going on. And for me, it was kind of getting to the space where I realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life calorie counting. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life being dictated around food and exercise. I was exhausted. I was so tired all the time. And I was thinking about food all the time. And so I had to think that, you know what do I actually want out of life? And a really big driving factor for me is I really wanted to have children. And off the back of having a child, I also then wanted to get to a space where I could have a healthy relationship with food and exercise, so that I wouldn't influence him with my behaviors, but also so that I could live in the moment with him and not get stressed about things and be okay having last minute meals out and things like that. And it's interesting. So I think for me, I am so close to the kind of cusp of getting there to be like, you know what, I am fully recovered. But I'm also really hyper aware that I still have days that I find things really challenging. And I have to be so careful on those days not to let the kind of eating disorder kind of start to dictate and completely take over. And I think every year around my birthday, I always have this time where I'm like, oh, I've had another year of this. This really sucks. And then I think, you know, I need to really push myself and drive myself to get to a better space. And yeah, it's hard work. And I think that's the thing with eating disorders is they do everything they can to catch you off guard and to kind of pull you into these moments. But for me, it's like at the moment, really focusing on challenging kind of food beliefs, focusing on why I want to stay well and get well, and looking at kind of the future, realizing I don't want to waste any more of my life with this. And I say all of that, and it makes it sound so easy. And if it was as easy as that, well, no one would have an eating disorder, no one would need treatment. And a lot of it for me has been sitting in all of those really painful moments, sitting with all the uncomfortable feelings around food and knowing that at some point they will pass, and knowing that at some point it's all going to be okay and it will all work itself out.
Yeah, it is a long journey. I mean, you've spent decades working on this and working through this. So it is sort of a up and down, and sometimes you take some steps forwards and some backwards. So if you are a loved one of someone who is struggling with an eating disorder, or you may suspect that they are, is there anything that you should or shouldn't do to support them? From your own experience, did you find some things that your family and friends were able to provide helpful, or did you find them unhelpful? Do you have any insights for people who are living, or it might be their children or their siblings who are living with eating disorders?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's always been about trying to have a direct conversation about things and kind of, yeah, like picking them up on things, like working out what's going on, working out where they've got that belief around the food from. I believe that the only way for people to get well is to bring out all of the behaviors and all of the emotions into the light. And in that way, people can really heal and start to heal and move forward. I think for me, what really helped kind of outside of my hospital admission was people understanding that eating disorders were about so much more than the food. They were because, again, what's going on for me. So when I felt triggered kind of historically, it's been about people checking in those moments. It's about people thinking really practically, how can they support me? If you've got big family events coming up, how are we working with that individual who struggles with food to make sure that the event is a safe space for them, where maybe not everything evolves around the food, where maybe you've set those boundaries in place so that people don't comment on their weight or what they're eating as well. And then I think beyond that, again, reminding carers and stuff that there's so much more to us than the eating disorder. I am not the eating disorder, I'm me. And there is so much more to my identity than that. And it's about sometimes kind of working with that individual, I think, and spending time with them to get out that part of them. I think for me, some of the best parts of my own journey, when there's been no focus necessarily on the eating disorder. And again, this is much further through my recovery. Obviously, at the beginning, you have to focus on the eating disorder, but definitely along the way, it's been about learning, again, for me to trust myself. And again, sending a message, I might send a message to my mum being like, do you know what, I feel really awful today. But knowing that just by telling her that, it means that it's kind of taken the power out of the food in a way. And again, makes me feel slightly less guilty about eating things. But I do think if people are worried about their loved ones, you have to get in there and have that conversation. You have to find a way to talk about it and not ignore what's happening.
Yeah, that will, like you said, take away some of that power of the eating disorders to actually open up about it and have conversations about that. So thank you very much for sharing that. This was a very insightful conversation that I hope was helpful to our listeners as well, who may be struggling themselves with an eating disorder or know someone who is, and to give them some hope and a way forward through this, even though the support might not be there on the governmental or societal level. But there are things that we can do, and societies and associations we can turn to. And as you said, when we find the right method, there is a big chance that we can fully recover from this. So there's that hope as well. Now, how would you like our listeners to connect with you? You are on the socials, you have campaigns. Let us know a little bit about that. How can they connect?
Yes, the best place, I think, to connect and see kind of what I'm up to, and also to ask any further questions, is probably on my Instagram, which is just Hope Virgo with an underscore. On that, you'll also see a huge amount of stuff about my Jump the Scales campaign, which is all around making sure that people with eating disorders can access the right support and the right treatment. In the UK, we're pushing for a lot of things around funding, proper investment into research services, kind of you name it. And then kind of on a global scale, again, trying to transform how people think about eating disorders, making sure people know how to spot the signs, where to get support, all of that as well. And it would be amazing, to have a look at it. And if you've got your own lived experience or you want to kind of share that with me on my platforms, obviously, I quite often share people's stories on Instagram. So I'm more than happy to kind of share other people's as well. And again, happy to answer any other questions people might have off the back of this too.
Amazing. And we, of course, will be linking to Hope's socials in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there on how you can connect with her. And if you feel like you would like to ask her a question or share your story, we will let you know how you can do that as well in the show notes. Well, this has been another incredible episode, and I really hope our listeners have found value and hope and support in our conversation about eating disorders. It has been fantastic chatting with you about this today, Hope, and thank you so much for taking the time to coming on and spending this time with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Take care, Hope.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Journey podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Journey on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejourney.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.